Before there were maps, before written language, before even the idea of borders existed, humans were already reading something far more complex than any drawing on paper. They followed animals across endless landscapes with no coordinates, no landmarks they could trust, and no guarantee they were even going in the right direction. Every broken blade of grass, every shifted stone, every faint mark in the soil was part of a system only the most attentive could understand. And somehow, they didn't just survive, they mastered it. Before we go deeper into this forgotten world of survival and intelligence, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy these kinds of ancient mysteries and deep history stories. Because what the first hunters were doing wasn't just tracking animals. It was reading the earth itself. A narrow valley sits under a heavy, shifting sky, the kind of sky that never feels still in the Ice Age world. Wind moves across open steppe grass like an unseen river, flattening it in long, rippling waves that vanish and reform without warning. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a herd has passed, not long ago, not far. Nothing is seen now except the aftermath, a faint compression in the earth, a broken stem of grass, a scatter of disturbed stones that look meaningless to any modern eye. But to the people moving through this landscape, these small disruptions are not silence. They are speech, they are direction, they are survival. Before anything like maps, before drawn lines or fixed borders, there is only this constant reading of the world as it changes minute by minute. A world where every step leaves a signature, and every signature carries intention. The hunters who move through this terrain do not imagine themselves as inventors of anything. They are simply responding to necessity. But what they are building, one observation at a time, is something far more complex than they could ever name. A living system of knowledge embedded in land, wind, animal behavior, and memory. Before going deeper into this forgotten intelligence of survival, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. These are the kinds of human stories that rarely appear in written records, yet shaped everything that came after civilization itself. The world they inhabit is not forgiving. Ice Age environments stretch across vast distances where forest breaks into tundra, and tundra dissolves into barren steppe. Temperature shifts can arrive without warning, and resources are never evenly distributed. In such a world, no single place can be relied upon. Nothing remains stable long enough to be marked on a map, even if maps existed. And so, the idea of place becomes fluid. It is defined not by boundaries, but by movement. The hunters move within this fluid geography, and what guides them is not sight alone. Sight is only the surface. Beneath it lies a deeper sensitivity, trained through repetition and necessity. They notice how grass bends differently when heavy bodies pass through it. They recognize how soil compresses under weight and slowly rebounds depending on moisture and temperature. They can tell when a track is fresh, not by measurement, but by feel, by the subtle difference between collapse and settling, between recent disturbance and old memory in the earth. Even broken twigs become messages. A snapped branch at shoulder height tells a different story than one broken near the ground. One suggests large-bodied movement, possibly a mammoth or bison herd pushing through dense brush. The other suggests smaller animals or even a fleeing predator. Nothing is random. Everything is interpreted. And yet, what makes this system remarkable is not just observation, but interpretation over time. A single mark means little. A sequence means everything. A footprint is not just a footprint. It is part of a chain that extends forward into uncertainty. The hunters do not just see what has happened. They imagine what is still happening beyond their vision. They reconstruct movement in real time, turning scattered evidence into flowing paths. The Ice Age world does not offer clarity. Wind erases tracks quickly. Snow covers entire landscapes overnight. Rain can dissolve hours of reading in minutes. This instability forces a different kind of intelligence to emerge, one that depends not on static knowledge, but on constant recalibration. A hunter who cannot adapt interpretation loses contact with reality itself. Survival depends on understanding that signs are temporary, but patterns repeat. In this sense, tracking becomes more than a skill. It becomes a way of thinking, not linear but recursive, not fixed but responsive. Each observation feeds into the next, and each decision reshapes the field of perception. Over time, the landscape itself becomes familiar not as a static map, but as a network of recurring behaviors routes animals prefer, places they avoid, corridors shaped by wind, water, and instinct that repeat across seasons. Archaeological evidence suggests that this form of awareness is ancient, far older than agriculture or permanent settlement. Cut marks on bones, arranged kill sites, and patterns of migration corridors all hint at a deep understanding of animal movement long before written history begins. But the record remains incomplete. What survives are fragments, not full systems. The intelligence behind them must be reconstructed carefully from what little remains. And yet, even these fragments reveal something extraordinary. Early humans are not passive observers of their environment. They are active participants in reading it, constantly negotiating between uncertainty and pattern recognition. Every journey becomes an act of interpretation. Every pursuit becomes a test of perception. As the wind shifts across the valley in this moment, carrying scent and sound in unpredictable currents, the hunters pause. Nothing is spoken. Communication is not necessary. Their attention is already aligned with the same invisible thread. Something passed through here, and it is still moving. Somewhere ahead, beyond the bend of land and the distortion of heat and distance, a path continues, not drawn, not marked, but remembered through signs scattered across the earth. What follows is not simply pursuit. It is an unfolding relationship between human perception and the living world itself, a dialogue written in footprints, broken grass, and the fading memory of motion. And as they step forward into that unseen trail, the landscape closes quietly behind them, as if it had never been disturbed at all. The valley gives way to a broader expanse where the land no longer feels like a contained place, but an open, breathing continuity. Grasslands stretch in uneven waves toward a distant horizon that never resolves into a clear line, only a gradual fading of earth into pale sky. This is the Ice Age steppe tundra at its most imposing state, a biome so wide that distance begins to lose meaning. For the hunters moving through it, the absence of landmarks is not just disorienting, it is structural. It reshapes how perception itself must operate. In this world, there are no reliable edges. Forests appear in scattered clusters, then disappear for tens of kilometers. Rivers shift their courses slowly over time, carving and abandoning channels that remain visible for generations. Ice forms in one season and retreats in another, leaving behind scars that resemble pathways but lead nowhere consistent. Nothing here is fixed long enough to serve as a reference point, and so survival requires a different kind of orientation system, one that does not depend on permanence. The hunters do not experience this landscape as empty. It is dense with information, but not the kind that can be written or stored externally. It exists in patterns of wind, in the distribution of prey species, in the subtle differences between one patch of soil and another. Even the temperature of ground underfoot becomes a clue. Frozen soil retains impressions differently than thawing ground, and experienced trackers can feel this variation through repeated contact, reading it as part of a larger environmental language. Modern observers sometimes imagine prehistoric hunters as moving randomly through wilderness, but archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests something far more structured. Even without maps, their movements often align with predictable ecological corridors. These are not invented pathways but natural ones, routes formed by the logic of terrain, water access, vegetation density, and seasonal migration. Over time, humans learn to move within these corridors as fluently as animals do. What makes the Ice Age environment particularly important is its instability. Climate fluctuations during this period are not slow and uniform but punctuated by abrupt shifts. A region that supports herds for several generations can become barren within decades. In response, both animals and humans are forced into constant adaptation. Herds shift their migration routes. Predators follow. Humans track both, adjusting their own movements in parallel. The landscape becomes a shared system of motion rather than a static backdrop. Within this system, tracking is not limited to immediate pursuit, it is predictive. A hunter observing a broken line of hoofprints does not simply ask where the animal has gone. The more important question is where it is likely to go next. This requires an understanding of terrain psychology, how animals respond to slopes, water sources, wind exposure, and the presence of other herds. Over time, this knowledge becomes intuitive, embedded in memory through repetition rather than formal instruction. Some of the most revealing evidence of this comes from kill sites discovered by archaeologists. At places like Upper Paleolithic camps in Eurasia, bones of large herd animals are often found clustered in ways that suggest coordinated hunting events rather than random encounters. Cut marks on bone surfaces indicate systematic butchering, while spatial distribution of remains suggests that hunters anticipated animal movement patterns well in advance. These sites are not accidents. They are the endpoints of extended reading of the landscape. Yet even with this evidence, many details remain uncertain. Scholars still debate the exact cognitive mechanisms behind such tracking behavior. It is clear that early humans possessed advanced observational skills, but whether this was purely learned through practice or supported by innate spatial cognition, shaped by evolution, is still unresolved. What survives in the record suggests a blending of both instinct refined by experience into something more structured than either alone. One lesser-known detail emerges from microscopic analysis of ancient sediments at certain archaeological sites. Traces of trampled vegetation often show repeated directional compression, suggesting that both animals and humans reuse specific paths over long periods. These paths are not formally constructed, yet they persist across generations. They are invisible maps etched not into paper or stone, but into the ground itself. As the hunters move through this vast steppe, they are not just following a single trail. They are navigating a network of overlapping histories. Each track they encounter may intersect with routes taken by other herds weeks or even seasons earlier. Distinguishing fresh movement from old requires continuous calibration. A misreading can lead to wasted energy, missed opportunities, or dangerous encounters with predators following the same paths. The wind becomes a critical factor in this calculation. It carries scent unevenly across open terrain, sometimes preserving traces of movement, sometimes erasing them entirely. experienced trackers learn to read wind direction not just as weather, but as a shaping force of information. A herd moving against the wind leaves different clues than one moving with it, and predators exploit these differences as much as prey does. In this way, the Ice Age steppe is not empty space. It is layered space, filled with overlapping signals that require constant interpretation. The hunters exist within this complexity, not above it. Their success depends not on domination of the environment, but on integration with its patterns. As they continue forward, the ground subtly shifts beneath their steps. A faint depression appears ahead, then another, forming a broken line that fades into the distance. It is not yet a clear path, but it is enough to suggest continuity, enough to suggest movement still in progress, enough to pull perception forward into the unknown. And so the pursuit continues, deeper into a landscape that never stays still long enough to be fully known, only partially understood through the traces it leaves behind. The faint depressions in the ground grow clearer as the hunters advance, not because the land becomes easier to read, but because their attention sharpens into something almost mechanical in its precision. Each step forward is an act of comparison. What lies beneath the next patch of earth is measured against what was seen moments before, and what is expected a little farther ahead. The track is no longer just a mark, it becomes a continuity, a fragile thread that holds together movement across time. A footprint in soft ground is never just an impression of presence. It is a record of pressure, direction, weight distribution, and even hesitation. In frozen or partially thawed terrain, the edges of a print may crumble differently depending on how recently it was formed. A fresh step holds sharper boundaries, while an older one softens, the soil slowly reclaiming its original shape. To the untrained eye, these differences are invisible. To a practiced tracker, they're as distinct as spoken language. What emerges here is one of the earliest known forms of environmental literacy. The hunters are not simply following animals, they are reading the ground as a constantly updating document. Soil composition, moisture levels, temperature variation, and wind exposure all affect how information is preserved or erased. A shallow imprint on dry, wind-exposed earth may vanish within hours, while a deeper print in damp soil can last for days. Understanding these differences allows the hunters to reconstruct time itself, not in abstract measurement, but in lived sequence. There is an important subtlety often overlooked in modern interpretations of prehistoric tracking. It is not only about identifying what animal passed through, it is about identifying the condition of passage. Was the animal moving quickly or cautiously? Was it alone or part of a group? Was it disturbed, fleeing, or simply travelling along a familiar route? These distinctions change the entire interpretation of the landscape. A herd moving calmly suggests predictable future movement. A herd in panic suggests predators nearby, and a radically altered trajectory that must be recalculated in real time. Archaeological sites occasionally preserve these behavioral clues in indirect ways. Bone accumulations at certain kill sites show evidence of rapid processing, suggesting urgency. In other cases, more orderly butchering indicates controlled, planned hunts. While these patterns cannot be linked directly to individual tracking events, they suggest a spectrum of hunting strategies shaped by real-time interpretation of environmental signs. The hunters themselves do not separate observation from action. There is no pause between seeing and responding. Interpretation happens while moving, and movement itself becomes part of interpretation. A change in wind direction can immediately alter the reliability of scent-based cues. A shift in cloud cover can change how shadows fall across the ground. revealing or hiding subtle disturbances. Even the angle of sunlight at different times of day affects visibility of depressions and broken vegetation. Everything is dynamic, and so perception must be equally dynamic. One of the most surprising aspects of early tracking behavior is its reliance on negative space. What is absent often carries as much meaning as what is present. A stretch of ground that should contain prints but does not may indicate a change in elevation, a hard surface, or deliberate avoidance by animals. Similarly, an unexpected cluster of disturbances may signal a resting point, a feeding area, or a moment of confusion within a herd. These absences and irregularities form a secondary layer of information that overlays the visible terrain. In some regions, particularly those shaped by repeated glacial cycles, the land itself preserves long-term patterns of movement. Ancient migration routes can persist across millennia, not as physical roads, but as tendencies embedded in geography. Valleys that funnel wind, ridges that provide visibility, and river crossings that offer safe passage all become recurring nodes in animal behavior. Humans, observing this repetition over generations, begin to recognize that movement is not random. It is structured by the land itself. This recognition leads to something more complex than simple following. It becomes anticipation. The hunters are no longer trailing directly behind animals. They are positioning themselves ahead of likely movement paths. This requires not just knowledge of tracks, but understanding of decision points. Where will a herd turn when encountering a river? How will it respond to narrowing valleys? What path will it choose when predators appear behind it? These are not questions answered in words, but in accumulated experience encoded in memory. Memory, in this context, is not static recall. It is spatial reconstruction. Each journey adds another layer of environmental familiarity. Over time, the landscape becomes mentally mapped not as fixed geometry, but as a network of probabilities and tendencies. Certain areas are remembered not for their appearance, but for their behavior. A place is known because it consistently produces certain signs at certain times of year. This is a map without lines, composed instead of expectations. Occasionally, subtle artifacts left behind by prehistoric hunters provide glimpses into this cognitive system. Stone tool scatters found along ancient routes suggest repeated use of specific corridors, possibly as staging points or observation areas. These locations are not random camps, but strategically chosen positions that maximize visibility of surrounding terrain. Even without written records, the spatial logic is clear vantage, access, and mobility are prioritized in a way that reflects deep environmental understanding. As the hunters continue, the faint trail they follow begins to split into variations. Some tracks drift slightly left, others continue straight, and a few fade entirely, erased by wind or ground hardness. Each divergence represents a decision made by animals moments or hours earlier. Reconstructing that decision becomes the central challenge. The hunters must decide which branch represents continuity and which represents deviation. There is no certainty, only probability shaped by experience. And so the landscape becomes not just something they move through, but something they continuously interpret under pressure. Every step forward is also a step backward in time, reconstructing what has already occurred in order to determine what might still be unfolding beyond sight. The faint line ahead does not guarantee success. It only suggests possibility. But in this world, possibility is enough to continue. The split in the trail does not announce itself with clarity. There is no sudden fork carved into the earth, no obvious divergence that signals a choice point in any formal sense. Instead, the separation exists as a gradual thinning of certainty. One line of movement weakens, becomes intermittent, then disappears into harder ground where impressions refuse to hold. Another continues, faint but persistent, as if the land itself is reluctantly agreeing to preserve it a little longer. To modern perception, this would still look like almost nothing. But for the hunters, the difference between continuation and loss is felt immediately, not as certainty, but as weighted probability. They slow not because they are unsure what they see, but because they are processing too many overlapping signals at once. The ground is no longer a single surface. It has become a composite of time, pressure, and erasure. Broken grass is one of the first secondary indicators they turn to, in open steppe, where footprints may fade quickly. Vegetation becomes a more stable witness. Grass blades bend differently depending on force and direction. A herd moving steadily leaves a broad, consistent flattening. A panicked movement creates irregular patches of compression, with stems snapped at varying heights. Even the angle at which plants recover can indicate how long ago the disturbance occurred. Recovery is slow, but not uniform, and that unevenness becomes a clock measured in living material. Stones offer another layer of interpretation. Small shifts in gravel fields or scattered rock surfaces can reveal passage even when soil refuses to hold impressions. A displaced pebble, slightly darker underneath from lack of exposure, can indicate recent movement. In regions shaped by freeze and thaw cycles, stones may shift subtly over time, but patterns of clustering and displacement still preserve traces of directional flow. The hunters read these micro-changes the way others might read ink on parchment. What is most striking in this form of observation is not the detail itself, but the integration of multiple weak signals into a coherent narrative. No single sign is reliable on its own. A broken blade of grass might be caused by wind. A footprint might be distorted by melting ice. A displaced stone might result from natural settling. But when dozens of such weak signals align in the same direction, they form a structure stronger than any individual clue. This is where tracking becomes something closer to reasoning than simple observation. It is a process of weighted interpretation, where uncertainty is not eliminated but organized. Modern archaeology occasionally finds evidence supporting this complexity in kill sites, where multiple environmental indicators suggest coordinated movement toward a single outcome. The spatial arrangement of remains implies anticipation rather than chance encounter, even if the exact cognitive steps remain invisible. In the shifting terrain ahead, a subtle change in elevation begins to alter everything. The ground rises gently, almost imperceptibly, but enough to affect water drainage, vegetation density, and animal movement. Such slopes are critical in Ice Age landscapes. They guide herds without forcing them, shaping flow like invisible hands. Animals prefer paths that minimize energy expenditure, and even slight gradients can redirect entire migration lines over time. The hunters recognize this immediately, not because the slope is visible in isolation, but because the pattern of signs begins to reorganize around it. Tracks that were once scattered begin to align. Broken vegetation appears more consistently along a narrow band. Wind exposure changes how scent disperses, making certain areas more readable than others. The landscape is not just changing shape, it is changing legibility. Wind itself becomes more complicated here. As it rises over uneven ground, it fractures into currents that carry scent unevenly across space. A herd moving uphill leaves a different atmospheric trace than one moving along a contour line. Predators can exploit these differences, and so can human trackers. Understanding wind is not about direction alone, but about behavior over terrain. It is an invisible mapping system layered on top of the physical one. There is a lesser-known detail in some ethnographic parallels with later indigenous tracking cultures that may reflect continuity from these ancient practices. Experienced trackers often describe a sense of reading ahead, not in a mystical sense, but as a cognitive projection of likely movement based on terrain pressure and environmental resistance. While this cannot be directly confirmed for Ice Age populations, it aligns with what modern cognitive science suggests about predictive perception in skilled spatial reasoning. As the hunters move along the faint but persistent line, the trail begins to behave less like a record of past movement and more like a guide to future movement. It subtly narrows where terrain constricts, widens where grazing becomes possible, and bends where water access might lie just beyond sight. These are not coincidences. They are reflections of how animal behavior interacts with landscape constraints. Yet uncertainty remains constant. A single hard surface can erase hours of interpretation. A sudden weather shift can reset visibility entirely. Snow, rain, or wind can dissolve continuity in minutes. This fragility forces continuous adaptation. The hunters never fully solve the trail. They simply stay close enough to its possibility to remain within its unfolding. At one point, the faint line ahead dissolves almost entirely into indistinct ground. For a brief stretch, there is nothing to follow, only ambiguity, but even this absence is meaningful. It suggests either a change in surface, a pause in movement, or a deliberate shift in direction that bypasses readable terrain. Each possibility leads to a different reconstruction of events, and so the hunters do what defines their entire mode of existence. They do not stop at loss of information. They expand the frame. Wider observation begins. Surrounding terrain is scanned for secondary indicators. Wind direction is reassessed. Distant vegetation patterns are compared. What was once a single line becomes a field of inference stretching across the land. Eventually, a faint re-emergence appears, subtle depressions reappearing where ground softens again, as if the movement had briefly stepped out of the record and then returned to it. It is not continuity in the strict sense. It is reconstruction through persistence, and that is enough. The pursuit does not resume so much as it never truly stops. The ground ahead changes again, not suddenly but through a slow accumulation of differences that only reveal themselves when compared against what came before. The steppe opens into a slightly more exposed corridor, where wind moves faster and more freely, stripping fine dust from the surface and leaving behind a harder, more resistant terrain. In places like this, the language of footprints weakens, but another language strengthens in its place scent carried farther. Vegetation patterns stretched into clearer lines, and movement shaped more openly by geography rather than concealment. For the hunters, this shift is not a problem, it is a translation. Every environment has its own way of preserving evidence, and experienced trackers do not expect consistency across landscapes. They expect transformation. What matters is not whether signs exist, but how they change form under different conditions. In open wind corridors, the world stops speaking through delicate impressions and begins speaking through broader patterns. Scent becomes especially important here. Though invisible, it behaves like a physical substance moving through space, carried, diluted, redirected by terrain. A herd passing through an exposed valley leaves a trailing signature that can persist even after footprints are erased. The hunters read this not with specialized tools, but through accumulated familiarity with how air behaves across uneven ground. Wind rising over ridges tends to separate scent into layers. Wind dropping into depressions concentrates it. These differences create invisible maps that exist only in motion. This sensitivity to atmospheric movement is not instinct alone. It is learned through repetition, failure, and gradual refinement. A misread wind can lead a group into empty terrain. A correctly interpreted one can shorten a pursuit by hours. Over time, hunters develop a kind of environmental intuition that integrates sight, smell, sound, and terrain into a single continuous perception. Nothing is isolated. Everything is connected in feedback loops of interpretation. In archaeological contexts, direct evidence of scent-based tracking is impossible to preserve, but indirect clues suggest its importance. Kill sites located in narrow valleys or wind funnels often show patterns consistent with ambush strategies, implying that hunters anticipated movement through sensory cues beyond visible tracks. While this cannot be proven definitively, it aligns with ecological logic in open environments where visual traces disappear quickly. Other senses naturally gain importance. As the hunters proceed, the trail they follow becomes less defined in physical terms and more defined in behavioral expectation. They're no longer simply following where animals have been. They're following where animals are likely to continue. This requires understanding not just movement, but motivation, hunger, migration pressure, predator avoidance, and seasonal instinct all shape direction. A herd is not random. It is responding to internal and external pressures that create predictable tendencies even in complex environments. One of the most critical of these pressures is water. Even in Ice Age ecosystems, water remains a constant organizing force. Rivers, melt channels, and seasonal pools dictate movement across vast distances. Animals do not merely wander toward water, they structure their entire migration cycles around its availability. Hunters, recognizing this, begin to treat water systems as hidden frameworks underlying all visible movement. A trail that fades in open ground may reappear near predictable crossings, bends, or confluences where terrain forces convergence. There is a subtle detail often overlooked in simplified reconstructions of prehistoric life. Water sources in glacial and periglacial environments are not static. They shift with seasons, ice melt patterns, and sediment deposition. A crossing used one year may become unusable the next. This instability forces both animals and humans to maintain flexible mental models of geography rather than fixed ones. The map exists as a set of probabilities rather than fixed coordinates. In this corridor of wind and shifting terrain, the hunters encounter one of the most important interpretive challenges in tracking, distinguishing intention from accident. A scattered set of prints may indicate normal movement through uneven ground, or it may reflect sudden disruption. A deviation in path may be strategic avoidance or simple response to obstacle. The difference is not visible in the ground itself, but inferred through context. Context, in this sense, becomes everything. Nearby terrain, wind direction, vegetation state, and the spacing of signs all contribute to interpretation. A single mark is meaningless without its surroundings. This is why tracking cannot be reduced to simple pattern recognition. It is a continuous synthesis of multiple environmental layers, each influencing the meaning of the others. At one point, the hunters pause near a shallow depression where the wind has gathered loose dust into faint swirling patterns. Here, the trail is almost invisible again, broken by hard ground and atmospheric interference. Yet they do not treat this as an ending. Instead, attention expands outward. Higher ground is scanned. Distant vegetation is compared for alignment with expected movement corridors. The absence of clear signs becomes a prompt for broader environmental reading. And then, slowly, coherence returns, not as a single clear line, but as a reassembly of small indicators, slight vegetation compression, faint directional disturbance in dust accumulation, and a subtle alignment of terrain features that suggest continued passage. The animals have not stopped. They have simply passed through a region that does not preserve their story well. This realization is central to understanding prehistoric tracking as a cognitive system. It is not dependent on continuous evidence. It survives discontinuity. It bridges gaps through inference, memory, and environmental understanding. Where modern maps rely on static representation, this system relies on active reconstruction. The hunters move forward again, not because certainty has returned, but because enough fragments align to suggest that continuation is more likely than loss. The trail remains incomplete, but it remains alive. And in a landscape defined by movement, that is all that is ever truly needed. The wind corridor begins to widen again, and with it the landscape shifts into something more deceptive than the open steppe. At first glance, nothing changes. The horizon remains distant. The grasslands still stretch in muted tones, and the sky still presses low with its familiar weight. But beneath this surface continuity, a more complex reality is unfolding. The terrain is subtly reorganizing itself into zones of preference, shaping where animals move, where they hesitate, and where they consistently return. The hunters recognize this not as a new place, but as a pattern intensification. Certain landscapes do not merely allow movement, they channel it. Over generations, herds of large mammals carve invisible logic into the environment simply by repeated passage. These are not roads in the human sense, but accumulated tendencies, ridgelines that offer safer visibility, valleys that reduce wind resistance, river crossings that remain shallow enough across seasons, slowly. These preferences become so reinforced that they function like highways without construction. This is where tracking evolves into something more than following traces. It becomes the study of behavioral geography. The hunters are no longer interpreting isolated signs, but entire systems of likely movement. A single footprint is no longer important in itself. What matters is whether it aligns with the larger structure of expected flow across the land. One of the most important aspects of this system is predictability through repetition. Animal movement in Ice Age ecosystems is not random wandering. It is shaped by survival efficiency. Energy conservation governs almost every decision. A herd will almost always prefer the path of least resistance unless forced otherwise by predators, seasonal pressure, or resource depletion. This creates a kind of ecological logic that experienced hunters learn to anticipate with increasing accuracy over time. In this corridor, the signs begin to align in a way that suggests repeated use. Vegetation is slightly more worn in narrow bands. Soil compaction appears uneven but directional. Even the distribution of small stones seems subtly reorganized along a consistent axis of movement. These are not dramatic indicators. They are accumulative, and it is precisely their subtlety that makes them reliable. Archaeological findings from multiple Upper Paleolithic sites support this idea indirectly. Locations associated with repeated hunting activity often cluster around geographic choke points, river crossings, narrow passes, and converging valleys. These are not random settlements. They appear to sit along long-standing animal movement routes that persisted across generations, while the hunters themselves left no written explanation. The spatial patterns suggest a deep understanding of these recurring ecological structures. Yet even within these predictable corridors, uncertainty remains constant. A herd that usually follows a stable route may deviate unexpectedly due to predator pressure or sudden environmental change. A river crossing may shift after seasonal flooding. A familiar valley may become temporarily hostile due to ice formation or resource depletion. Nothing is permanent, and so prediction always carries risk. This is why tracking in this context is never passive observation. It is active hypothesis testing. Each new sign is evaluated against an internal model of expected movement. When evidence aligns, confidence increases. When it diverges, the model is adjusted. Over time, this creates a dynamic mental system that is constantly refining itself in response to the land. In one subtle but critical moment along the corridor, the hunters encounter a divergence not in visible tracks, but in environmental behavior. The wind shifts direction across a low ridge, altering how scent disperses. Vegetation on one side of the ridge appears slightly more disturbed than on the other. The soil moisture changes subtly underfoot. None of these signals alone would be significant, but together they suggest a branching of a movement that occurred earlier than the visible record indicates. This is where deeper environmental reading becomes essential. The hunters begin to reconstruct not just where the animals are going, but where they were when they made the decision to split. This backward inference is a defining feature of advanced tracking. It transforms the landscape into a temporal puzzle, where each layer of evidence represents a different moment in time. There is also an often overlooked dimension in these systems, the role of microterrain. Small variations in elevation, barely noticeable rises, or depressions can dramatically alter movement behavior. A shallow dip in the ground may retain water longer, attracting grazing animals. A slight rise may offer better visibility against predators. These features, though minor in appearance, shape large-scale movement patterns over time. The hunters move through such a micro-landscape now, where every small variation matters. Attention is distributed across multiple scales simultaneously, the immediate ground beneath them, the mid-range terrain shaping movement corridors, and the distant horizon hinting at larger migration flows. This multi-layered perception is not consciously segmented. It is experienced as a unified field of awareness. At one point, the trail reasserts itself more clearly not as a continuous line, but as a convergence of reinforcing indicators. Tracks become slightly deeper, vegetation compression more consistent, and directional alignment more stable. It is not certainty, but it is coherence, and coherence in this environment is enough to continue. What is most remarkable about this system is how it transforms uncertainty into structure. Even when information is incomplete, the hunters are able to operate within it by constantly updating their understanding. They do not require full visibility. They require only enough consistency to maintain directional belief. And so they move forward once again, deeper into a landscape that never fully reveals itself, but always leaves just enough behind to be followed. The corridor begins to lose its clarity as the land gradually opens into a wider basin, where multiple subtle pathways intersect. It is not a crossroads in any formal sense, but a convergence shaped by geography itself. Water runoff from distant high ground has carved shallow channels through the soil over long periods, while migrating herds have reinforced certain directions more than others. The result is a landscape that does not guide movement in a single line, but distributes it across several competing tendencies. For the hunters, this is one of the most demanding conditions in all tracking environments. A single consistent trail is no longer available. Instead, there are fragments of movement scattered across a field of partial evidence. Some signs align with previous direction. Others suggest deviation. Still, others appear unrelated, likely caused by different animals or earlier seasons of passage. The challenge is no longer following a path, but determining which fragments belong to the same narrative. At this stage, memory becomes as important as observation, not memory in the sense of recalling a single past event, but memory as a spatial archive built from repeated exposure to similar environments. Hunters who have travelled through comparable basins before develop an intuitive sense of how movement behaves in such areas. They recognise how animals tend to spread out when entering open zones, how they regroup near water access points, and how predator pressure can scatter or compress movement patterns. This mental archive is not static, it evolves continuously. Each encounter with terrain refines future interpretation. Over time, the landscape ceases to be experienced as unknown space and instead becomes a library of familiar behaviours expressed in different combinations. What changes is not the rules of movement, but their arrangement. One of the most important cognitive developments implied by this kind of tracking behaviour is the construction of what modern researchers sometimes describe as mental geography. This is not a drawn map, but a structured internal model of terrain relationships. Distances are not measured precisely but understood relationally: how long it takes to cross certain features, how visibility changes across ridges, how sound travels through valleys. These relationships become the foundation for navigation in the absence of fixed reference points. In the basin ahead, faint traces of movement begin to re-emerge, but in a fragmented form. A cluster of compressed grass appears on one side of a shallow depression. A scattering of disturbed soil lies further along a slight incline. None of these alone is decisive, but together they suggest that movement did pass through this area, though not in a single unified direction. Instead, it appears to have dispersed, possibly in response to environmental pressure or internal herd dynamics. This introduces a critical concept in tracking differentiation between linear pursuit and distributed movement. Not all animal behavior follows a straight trajectory. Herds can split, pause, regroup, or scatter temporarily before reassembling further along their route. Understanding these variations is essential for reconstructing accurate paths. Without it, tracking becomes misleading, as isolated signs may be mistaken for continuity when they actually represent separate events. Archaeological evidence from kill sites in complex terrains supports this interpretation. In some locations, bone distribution suggests that hunters intercepted herds at points where movement naturally reconverged after temporary dispersion. These interception points are not random. They indicate an understanding of how animal groups reorganize themselves after passing through fragmented landscapes. As the hunters move deeper into the basin, they begin to prioritize structure over continuity. Instead of searching for a single line, they search for alignment across multiple weak indicators. The direction of compressed vegetation is compared with the orientation of faint hoof depressions. Soil displacement patterns are matched against wind direction and slope gradient. Even the spacing between signs becomes meaningful, as it may indicate changes in speed or group density. At one point, a subtle but important realization emerges from the accumulation of evidence: the movement ahead is not uniform, but stratified. Different groups of animals appear to have passed through at slightly different times, overlapping in some areas while diverging in others. This creates a layered pattern of traces that must be separated mentally before a coherent path can be reconstructed. This ability to disentangle overlapping movement is one of the most sophisticated aspects of prehistoric tracking. It requires distinguishing between time layers embedded in the same physical space. A fresh print may sit beside an older one. A recent disturbance may partially obscure an earlier path. Reading this correctly means reconstructing temporal order from spatial overlap. Environmental conditions in the basin amplify this complexity. Soft ground retains impressions longer, while wind-exposed areas erase them quickly. Small variations in moisture can preserve or distort evidence. Even insect activity or natural decay contributes to the transformation of signs over time. The hunters must continuously adjust their interpretations to account for these variables. Despite the fragmentation, a subtle coherence begins to reappear. Certain directional tendencies become more frequent. Signs begin to align loosely toward a narrowing section of terrain where the basin gradually funnels into a more defined passage. This is not certainty, but it is convergence. And convergence in tracking terms is often more important than clarity. The hunters adjust their movement accordingly, not accelerating but refining attention. Every step becomes a confirmation process. The landscape ahead is still uncertain, but it is no longer entirely ambiguous. Patterns are beginning to reassemble. And within that reassembly lies the possibility of continuation. The basin narrows gradually into a transitional stretch of land where openness and constraint exist at the same time, layered over one another in a way that makes orientation less about space and more about rhythm. The ground rises in gentle folds, then falls into shallow troughs that guide movement without fully controlling it. Vegetation becomes slightly denser in protected pockets, while exposed ridges remain stripped by persistent wind. It is a landscape that does not dictate direction, but strongly influences probability. Here, the hunters begin to operate less as followers and more as coordinators of movement. The trail is no longer a single entity to be tracked. It has become a distributed pattern that must be reconstructed collectively. Each individual in the group contributes partial observations, and those fragments are mentally assembled into a shared understanding of direction. There is no need for spoken instruction in the way modern systems might require. Coordination emerges from aligned perception. This kind of group tracking is not simply cooperation in a basic sense. It is synchronization of attention. Each hunter scans a different segment of terrain, but all attuned to the same underlying question: where does movement converge next? This shared focus allows the group to cover more environmental information without redundancy. It is an early form of distributed cognition, where perception is extended across multiple bodies. Evidence from ethnographic analogies with later hunter-gatherer societies suggests that such coordination often relies on subtle, non-verbal cues, changes in walking pace, shifts in posture, or slight adjustments in direction that signal interpretation without interruption. While we cannot directly observe this in Ice Age groups, the efficiency required for successful large animal tracking strongly implies some form of similar coordination system. As the group advances, the terrain begins to reveal faint asymmetries in movement. On one side of a shallow rise, vegetation appears slightly more flattened than on the other. In a narrow depression, soil disturbance suggests repeated passage rather than a single event. These are not strong indicators individually, but together they begin to define a corridor of higher probability. The hunters adjust their path accordingly, not committing fully, but leaning into the emerging structure. One of the most important aspects of group tracking in such environments is error correction. A single individual may misinterpret a sign, but the presence of multiple observers reduces the likelihood of collective deviation. When interpretations align, confidence increases. When they diverge, the group slows, reassesses, and expands observation range. This constant feedback loop ensures that movement remains adaptive rather than rigid. At a certain point, the hunters encounter a subtle but significant environmental shift. The ground becomes slightly firmer, less receptive to detailed footprints, but more revealing in terms of pressure distribution. Instead of clear impressions, what remains are shallow compressions that indicate weight and direction rather than precise shape. This forces a shift in interpretive strategy. The focus moves from identifying exact prints to reading broader pressure fields across the terrain. This transition highlights an important principle in prehistoric tracking. The same environment can encode information differently depending on conditions. Soil, temperature, moisture, and wind all influence what is preserved and what is lost. Skilled trackers do not rely on a single type of evidence. They adapt to whatever form the environment chooses to retain. In this stretch, the hunters begin to notice something more complex emerging from the scattered signs. Movement is not only directional, but layered in intensity. Certain areas show heavier compression, suggesting larger groups or repeated passage. Other areas show lighter, more sporadic disturbance, likely from smaller subgroups or individuals moving at different times. This layering suggests that the herd structure itself is dynamic, not uniform. Such complexity is critical for understanding prey behavior. Herds are not static units. They respond to internal social structure, environmental stress, and predator presence by splitting and rejoining. Recognizing these patterns allows hunters to anticipate future configurations rather than simply reacting to past movement. It transforms tracking into behavioral prediction. Archaeological evidence from coordinated kill sites supports the idea that prehistoric hunters understood these dynamics. Some sites show evidence of interception at natural funnel points, where dispersed groups would reconverge. The spatial arrangement of remains suggests anticipation of this reassembly, implying a sophisticated understanding of herd dispersion and regrouping cycles. As the hunters move deeper into the narrowing terrain, their attention becomes increasingly focused on convergence points rather than continuous trails. The goal is no longer to follow every trace, but to identify where traces become densest, where movement is most likely to concentrate again. This represents a shift from linear tracking to structural tracking. At moments, the trail seems to almost disappear entirely, broken by hard ground or environmental smoothing. But instead of halting progress, this absence triggers expansion of perception. The group scans wider arcs of terrain, integrating distant vegetation patterns, slope alignment, and wind exposure into their analysis. What is missing at ground level is compensated for at the environmental scale. Gradually, coherence returns not as a single visible path, but as directional agreement among multiple weak signals. The terrain itself begins to suggest a narrowing flow, guiding movement toward a more confined passage ahead. It is not certainty, but it is alignment, and alignment is enough to proceed. The hunters continue forward, moving as a coordinated system of perception, drawn not by a single trail, but by the cumulative weight of many small truths embedded in the land. The narrowing passage ahead is no longer just a feature of terrain, but a mechanism of movement itself. The land compresses slightly between rising formations, guiding wind, water runoff, and living traffic into a shared corridor that has likely existed in some form for thousands of years. It is not carved deliberately, yet it behaves as if it has intention. In such places, the difference between geography and behavior begins to blur, and the hunters find themselves moving within a system that is larger than any single journey. Here, the traces of animals are no longer scattered or ambiguous. They begin to accumulate with subtle consistency. The ground shows repeated compression along the same general axis. Vegetation is worn into narrow bands that suggest habitual passage rather than isolated events. Even the distribution of dung and broken stems, though rare and often degraded by time, aligns with the directional flow that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. This is not a single pursuit anymore. It is the intersection of many past movements layered into one enduring pathway. What emerges in this moment is the recognition of migration highways, natural corridors shaped not by construction, but by long-term ecological repetition. Herds do not choose these routes consciously in the human sense. They follow gradients of survival efficiency, access to water, avoidance of predators, ease of travel, and seasonal resource distribution. Over generations, these choices reinforce themselves until the landscape itself appears to prefer certain directions of movement. The hunters are not discovering a new path. They are entering a structure that has been reinforced by countless cycles of animal life. Every step forward is also a step into accumulated history, where each layer of passage has slightly reshaped the terrain to favor continuation along the same trajectory. One of the most important but least visible aspects of these corridors is their temporal depth. A migration route is not simply a spatial feature, it is a time-dependent system. In some seasons, it becomes more active. In others, it nearly disappears. Climate fluctuations during the Ice Age amplify this variability, causing herds to shift timing, density, and even species composition across decades. The hunters must therefore interpret not only where movement occurs, but when it is likely to reoccur. Archaeological patterns suggest that many prehistoric hunting sites align with these corridors. Rather than random encounters, the spatial distribution of kill sites often clusters along predictable funnel points where terrain forces convergence. These include river narrows, ridgeline passes, and transitional zones between ecological zones. Such locations are not chosen arbitrarily. They represent points where long-term animal behavior becomes briefly visible in concentrated form. As the hunters proceed deeper into the corridor, the sense of continuity strengthens. Tracks become more coherent, not necessarily clearer, but more consistent in direction and spacing. The variability that characterized earlier terrain begins to diminish. This reduction in randomness is itself a signal. It suggests sustained movement rather than fragmented passage, and sustained movement implies proximity to larger herd structures. Yet even within this apparent coherence, uncertainty remains embedded. Environmental forces continue to distort the record. Wind can erase surface evidence within hours. Shifting soil can blur distinctions between fresh and old impressions. And predator activity, particularly wolves and large cats, can alter herd movement in unpredictable bursts. The hunters must constantly adjust their interpretation to account for these disruptions. A subtle but important detail appears along the path. Occasional clusters of deeper impressions spaced at irregular intervals. These are not continuous footprints, but punctuated points of heavier pressure. Such patterns often indicate moments of hesitation, rest, or environmental negotiation by the herd, perhaps a brief stop near water or a response to perceived danger. These pauses are critical because they reveal decision points in animal behavior. Understanding these pauses allows hunters to reconstruct not just movement, but intent. While intent in animals is not conscious planning in human terms, it reflects biological responses shaped by survival pressure. Where a herd pauses, it is making an environmental calculation, and by identifying those points, hunters gain insight into the logic governing movement. There is a lesser discussed aspect in paleoanthropological interpretation that supports this idea. Isotopic analysis of faunal remains from certain sites suggests seasonal clustering of animal activity in predictable regions. This implies that ancient hunters were likely aware of temporal windows when movement density increased, allowing for more efficient interception strategies. In the corridor, the land begins to subtly rise again, tightening the passage further. This narrowing effect amplifies all existing signals. Even weak traces become more legible because movement is forced into a constrained space. Vegetation patterns align more clearly. Soil compression becomes more uniform. Wind is channeled along the same axis, carrying scent and sound in more predictable ways. The hunters adjust to this intensification without hesitation. Their tracking no longer relies on searching for signs but on confirming direction. The corridor itself now acts as a guiding structure, instead of reconstructing movement from scattered evidence. They are following a preformed channel shaped by repeated ecological behavior. At one moment, the trail becomes almost self-evident, not because the signs are stronger, but because they are no longer competing with alternative directions. The environment has narrowed possibilities until only one logical flow remains. This is the moment where tracking shifts from interpretation to alignment. Still, caution remains essential. Corridors like this can also be used by multiple species simultaneously, including predators that follow the same routes. Wolves, in particular, are known to shadow herd movements, exploiting the same environmental logic. The hunters are not alone in reading this system. Yet despite this shared awareness, the corridor continues to pull all movement forward in the same direction. It is not certainty that drives the hunters, but coherence. And coherence, in a world defined by instability, is the closest thing to certainty that exists. They continue forward, deeper into the narrowing passage where land, wind, and life all begin to converge into a single unfolding direction. The corridor begins to open again, but not into emptiness. Instead, it expands into a broad transitional zone where seasonal forces become more visible than geography itself. The ground here carries a different kind of memory. It is not only shaped by passage, but by repetition across time. The same routes are used, abandoned, and reused again as climate cycles shift. What looks like space is actually rhythm and ecological calendar written into soil, vegetation, and movement. In this region, the hunters begin to recognize something crucial. The animals they follow are not moving randomly through landscape, but responding to seasonal pressure in ways that are both predictable and fragile. Temperature shifts, snow accumulation, melt cycles, and vegetation regrowth all combine to create timing windows that dictate migration. A route that is viable in one season may become impassable or dangerous in another. The land is not only a map of space, but a map of time. This realization changes the meaning of tracking again. It is no longer only about direction or path continuity. It becomes about timing inference. The hunters are not simply asking where the herd is going. They are asking when it moved, how recently it passed, and whether it is still within the same seasonal cycle of movement. A track is no longer just evidence of presence. It is a timestamp embedded in the ground. Subtle environmental cues begin to carry more weight here than direct impressions. The angle of plant regrowth, the rate of snow melt in shaded depressions, and the density of insect activity all contribute to reconstructing the timeline of passage. A footprint alone cannot answer these questions. It must be interpreted within a broader ecological context. This is where tracking becomes deeply integrated with seasonal ecology. Ice Age environments amplify this relationship between season and movement. In colder phases, resource scarcity forces herds into tighter, more predictable routes. In slightly warmer phases, movement spreads outward, becoming less concentrated but more complex. Hunters who understand these cycles gain a significant advantage, not because they can see farther, but because they can predict behavior over time. Archaeological evidence supports this seasonal intelligence indirectly. Kill sites often show repeated use during specific climatic windows rather than random distribution throughout the year. Some locations appear to function as seasonal interception points, where migrating herds consistently pass during predictable intervals. This suggests that prehistoric hunters were not only tracking movement, but also anticipating its return. As the hunters move deeper into this seasonal zone, the trail they follow becomes increasingly defined by recurrence rather than novelty. Signs appear familiar in structure, even when their exact placement differs. Vegetation compression follows patterns that echo earlier sections of the journey, suggesting that similar environmental conditions are producing similar movement behaviors. Yet even here, uncertainty remains a constant companion. Seasonal systems are never perfectly stable. A delayed freeze, an early thaw, or a sudden drought can shift entire migration schedules. The hunters must remain flexible, adjusting their interpretations as conditions evolve. A trail that appears fresh may in fact belong to an earlier cycle. A weak signal may represent a critical shift in timing rather than a minor deviation. One of the most important realizations in this section of the landscape is that time itself becomes layered in the environment. Multiple seasonal traces overlap in the same physical space. A single corridor may contain evidence of spring movement, autumn return, and even older cycles beneath the surface. Distinguishing between these layers requires not just observation, but contextual calibration across multiple environmental indicators. At a key moment, the hunters encounter a subtle convergence of signs that suggests synchronization with a current seasonal migration cycle. Vegetation disturbance aligns with expected grazing patterns for this time of year. Soil moisture corresponds with recent thaw conditions. Wind exposure patterns match known seasonal airflow shifts. None of these are definitive on their own, but together they indicate that the herd is likely still within the active migration window. This is where tracking becomes most powerful as a predictive system. By integrating seasonal knowledge with real-time environmental reading, the hunters are no longer simply reacting to past movement. They are positioning themselves within a living cycle that repeats with variation across time. The land is no longer just a record of what has happened. It becomes a forecast of what is still unfolding. A lesser-known but important detail in paleoecological research supports this idea. Analysis of pollen and sediment layers in some ancient sites shows repeated seasonal occupation patterns aligned with animal migration cycles. These patterns suggest that both humans and animals were operating within shared temporal rhythms shaped by climate, vegetation, and resource availability. In the present corridor, this shared rhythm becomes increasingly apparent. The hunters move not just through space, but through a seasonal system that constrains and guides all life within it. The trail ahead is not merely a direction. It is a timing window that is still open but narrowing. As they continue forward, the awareness deepens. They are not chasing something lost in the past. They are moving alongside something that is still in motion, still unfolding within the cycle of the land. And that realization tightens the urgency of every step. The light begins to shift as the corridor subtly bends toward a more broken landscape, where low ridges interrupt sight lines and shallow depressions collect the fading glow of day. This is no longer the open clarity of steppe movement or the structured flow of migration corridors. It is a fractured terrain where visibility is fragmented and every sound, scent, and shadow carries disproportionate weight. In such conditions, tracking changes character again, becoming less about reading continuous movement and more about reconstructing it from interrupted fragments. As daylight weakens, the hunter's perception adjusts in ways that are both physical and cognitive. Details at ground level become harder to distinguish, while contrasts at mid-distance sharpen slightly due to changing angles of light. Shadows stretch across uneven ground, sometimes exaggerating depressions that are not truly significant, and sometimes hiding subtle but important disturbances. The reliability of visual reading declines, forcing greater dependence on memory, inference, and environmental familiarity. Night is not yet complete, but its presence is already shaping behavior. In Ice Age environments, this transition period is critical. It is during these shifting hours that movement becomes most uncertain, both for prey and predator. Herds tend to tighten their formation, reduce speed, or seek more stable terrain. Predators, in turn, adjust their strategies, often moving along the same corridors but at different layers of silence. The landscape becomes multi-layered in activity even when visibility suggests stillness. Fire, where available, introduces a new dimension into this environment, not as illumination alone, but as a behavioral tool. Controlled flame alters predator movement patterns, deters certain animals, and provides focal points for human coordination, while direct archaeological evidence of fire use in specific tracking moments is limited. Broader Upper Paleolithic sites confirm its widespread presence and strategic importance. It is not simply warmth or light. It is spatial influence over other life. In the absence of strong firelight at this moment, the hunters rely more heavily on non-visual cues. Sound becomes more pronounced. A distant shift in gravel, the faint compression of vegetation, or the irregular break of a wind across terrain features can all indicate movement ahead. These cues are subtle and often ambiguous, but in combination they allow reconstruction of activity even when sight is compromised. One particularly important aspect of night-adjacent tracking is the reinterpretation of uncertainty. During daylight, missing information is often treated as a gap to be filled through expansion of observation. In low light, missing information becomes structural. It is accepted as part of the system itself. The hunters do not attempt to eliminate ambiguity. They incorporate it into their decision-making process, allowing multiple possibilities to coexist until stronger signals resolve them. As they move through the broken terrain, faint traces begin to reappear in intermittent patterns. A disturbed patch of ground appears near a ridge base. Further along, vegetation shows uneven compression consistent with directional passage. These signs are not continuous, but they are aligned enough to suggest that movement has not ceased. Instead, it has adapted to terrain constraints, shifting into less visible pathways. This adaptation is critical. Animals in this environment are not passive elements being followed. They're active participants responding to the same environmental pressures as the hunters. Reduced visibility encourages more cautious movement. Predators influence herd spacing. Terrain fragmentation forces temporary dispersal. The result is a constantly shifting interaction between multiple moving systems within the same space. There is a subtle but important cognitive shift occurring in the hunters at this stage. Tracking is no longer centered on the certainty of presence. It becomes centered on continuity of behavior. Even when direct signs weaken, the assumption of continued movement persists as long as environmental logic remains consistent. This is not blind belief, but structured inference grounded in long-term observation of how animals behave under similar conditions. Archaeological interpretations of nocturnal or low-visibility hunting contexts remain speculative, but some site distributions suggest that human groups were capable of operating effectively during twilight or night-adjacent periods. The spatial arrangement of remains in certain contexts implies coordinated movement under reduced visibility, likely supported by deep familiarity with terrain rather than immediate visual confirmation. In the present terrain, the hunters encounter a moment of near erasure. A stretch of ground shows no clear signs of passage, only irregular texture shaped by wind and natural settling. For a brief period, the trail seems to dissolve entirely, but instead of halting, the group expands its interpretive range. Surrounding ridges are scanned for directional alignment. Wind behavior is reassessed. Distant vegetation patterns are compared for continuity. The absence of immediate evidence becomes a prompt for broader reconstruction. Then, almost imperceptibly, coherence returns, not through a clear footprint or obvious mark, but through alignment of subtle indicators, a consistent directional shift in vegetation compression, a faint depression pattern reappearing at the base of a slope, and a slight continuity in terrain disturbance across an otherwise uniform surface. The trail is not restored as certainty, but as probability. Firelight flickers faintly in memory of past use, but here the hunters rely on something older and more persistent than flame. They rely on accumulated understanding of how movement persists even when visibility fails. The landscape continues to speak, but in a quieter register, one that demands attention rather than observation. And so they continue forward into the fractured edge of day, where tracking becomes less about seeing what is there and more about understanding what must still be moving beyond sight. The fractured terrain gradually tightens into a more rugged stretch where elevation changes become sharper and the ground itself feels less forgiving underfoot. Small ridge lines rise unexpectedly, breaking sight lines into fragments, while narrow dips collect cold air that moves differently from the surrounding flow. In this environment, tracking no longer behaves like a continuous narrative. It becomes a sequence of reassembled fragments, each one dependent on the next for meaning. As the hunters advance, the presence of other life becomes increasingly evident, not through clear sightings but through shared environmental signatures. Broken vegetation appears in patterns that suggest more than one species moving through the same corridor. Disturbed soil carries overlapping impressions, some fresh, others partially eroded. Even the spacing of movement suggests competition for space rather than solitary passage. This is not a corridor used by a single herd. It is a shared route, contested and reused by multiple forms of life. Among these forms are predators. Wolves, in particular, occupy the same ecological logic as the herds they follow. They do not create routes, but they exploit existing ones. Their movement often shadows migration corridors, using the same terrain advantages that make these paths efficient for prey. The hunters are aware, in a deep and experiential sense, that they are not alone in interpreting this landscape. The trail they follow is also being read by other minds shaped by survival pressure. This introduces a new layer of complexity into tracking competition over interpretation. The same signs that guide human hunters may also guide predators. A disturbed patch of ground does not belong to one narrative alone. It may represent herd movement, predator pursuit, or a convergence of both. Understanding which scenario is unfolding requires reading not just the signs themselves, but the relationships between them. In some areas, the evidence suggests direct interaction. Sudden directional shifts in movement patterns indicate moments of disruption. Tight clustering of tracks suggests compression caused by fear or pursuit. Abrupt changes in terrain use imply avoidance behavior. These are not isolated clues. They form a behavioral dialogue between species sharing the same space. Archaeological sites from the Upper Paleolithic occasionally reveal indirect evidence of this shared pressure. Bone assemblages sometimes show signs of both human and predator activity in close proximity, suggesting that kill sites were not only places of human success but also zones of competition. Cut marks and gnaw marks appearing on the same remains indicate overlapping access to resources, though not necessarily simultaneous encounters. As the hunters move deeper into this contested corridor, their tracking strategy subtly adjusts. Attention shifts from simple forward continuity to awareness of disruption patterns. A clean, uninterrupted trail is no longer expected. Instead, they anticipate interference. Gaps in evidence are interpreted not only as environmental erasure, but also as potential indicators of predatory interaction. One particularly important realization emerges in this phase. Predators do not simply follow herds, they reshape their movement. The presence of wolves or large cats can alter herd spacing, speed, and even route selection. This means that the trail the hunters are following is no longer a direct reflection of herd intention. It is a composite outcome of multiple interacting pressures. This complicates interpretation significantly. A deviation in direction may not be environmental but reactive. A sudden concentration of tracks may indicate regrouping after disturbance. A temporary absence of signs may reflect accelerated movement rather than disappearance. Each possibility must be held in suspension until additional evidence resolves ambiguity. The terrain itself begins to reflect this layered tension. Narrow passages show signs of repeated use by different species at different times. Ridge edges carry faint compression lines, suggesting careful movement along elevated ground, likely used for visibility advantage. Depressions below show heavier disturbance, possibly from faster or more chaotic passage. The landscape becomes stratified by behavior. At one point, the hunters encounter a subtle but telling pattern, a sequence of tracks that appear to converge and then abruptly diverge again within a short distance. This pattern is consistent with moments of pursuit or avoidance, where herd movement briefly compresses before scattering. While not definitive proof of predator interaction, it strongly suggests environmental pressure beyond routine migration. In such moments, interpretation becomes highly sensitive to context. A single misreading could lead the group into a dangerous zone or away from the target entirely. The hunters slow, expanding their observational field. They examine slope angles, wind direction shifts, and vegetation disturbance density. Every element is weighed against the possibility of recent disruption. There is no certainty in this environment, only degrees of alignment between competing explanations. Herd movement, predator pressure, and terrain constraints all produce overlapping signatures. The skill lies in distinguishing which influence is dominant at a given moment without excluding the others entirely. Eventually, a faint directional consistency begins to emerge again. Despite signs of interference, the overall flow of movement still trends along the same general axis. This suggests that while disruption has occurred, it has not fundamentally altered the underlying migration direction. The herd is still within the corridor, still moving, still responding to seasonal and ecological pressures. The hunters adjust accordingly, maintaining forward movement but with heightened awareness of potential disruption points. The corridor ahead is no longer just a path of prey movement. It is a shared ecological space where multiple survival strategies intersect. And within that intersection, every sign carries more than one possible meaning. The corridor begins to lose its harsh fragmentation as the terrain gradually softens into broader, more continuous slopes. The sharp ridges give way to rolling transitions, and the scattered complexity of earlier ground begins to resolve into patterns that feel less chaotic and more structured. Yet this apparent easing does not simplify the task of tracking. Instead, it shifts the challenge inward, from reading the land to refining the mind that reads it. At this stage of pursuit, the hunters are no longer dealing primarily with missing information. They are dealing with overwhelming continuity. The signs are no longer scarce or fragmented. They are abundant but subtle, distributed across multiple layers of environmental change. The difficulty lies in filtering what is meaningful from what is incidental, what is directional from what is coincidental. This is where spatial intelligence reaches its most refined expression. The human mind, under sustained pressure of survival in such environments, develops an extraordinary capacity for integrating large-scale environmental variables into a single interpretive framework. Terrain slope, vegetation density, wind behavior, soil composition, animal pressure patterns, and even seasonal memory all converge into a unified sense of direction, not calculated step by step, but perceived as a whole. Modern cognitive science suggests that this kind of ability relies heavily on predictive processing. The brain does not simply record what is seen, it continuously generates expectations about what should be present next, based on accumulated experience. When reality aligns with prediction, perception feels smooth and coherent. When it deviates, attention sharpens. In the context of prehistoric tracking, this mechanism becomes finely tuned through constant exposure to environmental uncertainty. Within the hunter's experience, this manifests as a kind of forward-reading perception. The land is not only observed in the present moment, but is constantly extended mentally into what is likely to come next. A slope is not just a slope. It is a forecast of movement speed. A narrowing valley is not just a geographic feature. It is a prediction of convergence. A shift in vegetation density is not just ecological variation. It is an indicator of sustained passage or temporary pause. As the terrain smooths, this predictive reading becomes more important than direct evidence. Footprints and disturbances still exist, but they are no longer the primary source of information. Instead, they confirm or adjust a larger mental model already forming in the background. The hunters are effectively moving through a continuously updated reconstruction of animal behavior rather than reacting to isolated traces. Archaeological interpretations of such cognitive sophistication remain indirect, but the consistency of large animal hunting strategies across upper Paleolithic sites suggests a high level of environmental modeling. Coordinated drives, strategic positioning near funnel points, and repeated use of terrain-based interception zones all imply anticipatory planning based on landscape understanding rather than opportunistic encounters. In the present landscape, the trail begins to exhibit a new form of coherence. It is no longer defined by continuous physical marks, but by alignment across environmental systems. Wind patterns begin to converge along a consistent axis. Vegetation compression becomes more uniform across wider areas. Soil disturbances, though faint, point in a shared direction of travel. Each indicator alone is weak, but together they reinforce a stable directional logic. Yet even within this coherence, the hunters remain cautious. Predictive perception can be misleading if based on incomplete data. A landscape may appear to guide movement in one direction, while recent environmental disruptions have temporarily altered actual behavior. This is why interpretation must remain flexible, always open to revision as new signals emerge. A particularly important subtlety appears here: the difference between movement continuity and movement intention. Continuity refers to the physical persistence of tracks across space. Intention refers to the underlying behavioral drivers shaping those tracks. A herd may continue along a path simply because terrain permits it, or because seasonal pressure compels it, or because external threat forces it forward. Distinguishing between these requires integrating multiple environmental layers simultaneously. The hunters begin to sense that the movement ahead is increasingly driven by structural necessity rather than choice. The terrain is guiding behavior more than individual decision-making within the herd. This creates a kind of predictable rigidity in the flow of movement. While still complex, it becomes more stable in direction. At one point, a broad expanse opens slightly ahead, revealing faint but consistent directional alignment across a wide area. This is not a clear trail, but a directional field, an environment where almost every weak signal subtly reinforces the same trajectory. Even in the absence of strong physical evidence, the landscape itself suggests continuity. This is a critical moment in advanced tracking, when environmental coherence replaces direct trace following as the primary guide. The hunters are no longer reconstructing movement from the past. They are synchronizing with a system that is still actively unfolding in the present. There is a quiet tension in this realization. The certainty of direction increases, but so does the awareness that such systems are fragile. A sudden change in weather, a predator-driven disruption, or a shift in herd behavior could collapse the coherence at any moment. Nothing is guaranteed. Everything is conditional. Still, the alignment holds, and as long as it holds, it becomes the path forward. The hunters continue, moving through a landscape that no longer needs to be read piece by piece, but instead felt as a continuous structure of motion. The directional field that had formed across the landscape begins to tighten again as the terrain gradually compresses into a more defined passage. What was once a broad alignment of subtle environmental cues now converges into a narrower corridor where evidence becomes easier to interpret but harder to ignore. The land here feels less like a scattered system of probabilities and more like a guided flow, as if the earlier uncertainty was only preparation for this more concentrated expression of movement. At this stage, the hunters encounter something that changes the nature of interpretation. Once again, persistence across multiple layers of time. The signs they read are no longer only recent or immediate. They begin to overlap with older traces embedded in the ground, revealing that this corridor has been used repeatedly across long cycles of animal movement. Some impressions are faint and partially eroded, while others are sharper and more recent, creating a stratified record of passage that spans different moments in the past. This layering forces a more refined form of reading. The hunters must distinguish not only direction, but temporal origin. A deeper print may belong to an earlier migration cycle, while a lighter but sharper impression indicates recent passage. Vegetation recovery patterns add another dimension, showing how long certain disturbances have been left undisturbed. The land is no longer simply a map of movement. It is a palimpsest of repeated journeys written over one another. Archaeological findings in similar ecological corridors support this interpretation. Repeated occupation layers found at some Upper Paleolithic sites show clear evidence of long-term reuse of specific routes and locations. These are not random accumulations, but structured revisitations of the same environmental pathways, suggesting that both humans and animals operated within deeply embedded spatial memory systems tied to landscape familiarity. In the present corridor, this accumulated memory becomes increasingly visible. The hunters are no longer following a single continuous event. They are navigating a system that has been reinforced across generations of movement. Every step forward is layered with echoes of earlier passages, each one slightly reshaped by time but still aligned with the same underlying geography. One of the most important realizations in this phase is that the trail is not simply something being followed, it is something that has been continuously rebuilt. Each herd passing through this corridor reinforces its structure. Each seasonal migration strengthens its directional bias. Even erosion and environmental change do not erase it entirely. They modify its expression but preserve its tendency. As the hunters move deeper, the corridor begins to show signs of recent intensification. Vegetation compression becomes more uniform. Soil disturbance patterns align more clearly along a central axis. Even the subtle distribution of small stones suggests repeated directional pressure. These signals indicate that the most recent migration cycle has passed through here not long ago, and likely continues ahead within a predictable time frame. Yet even with this clarity, uncertainty remains embedded in the system. Environmental disruptions can still distort interpretation. A localized weather event may erase sections of the trail. Predator interference may alter herd movement in ways that are not immediately visible. The hunters must constantly balance the strength of accumulated evidence against the possibility of recent deviation. At a key moment, a particularly strong convergence of signs appears. The alignment of vegetation, soil compression, and wind-carried scent all reinforce a single direction with unusual consistency. This is not absolute certainty, but it is one of the strongest indicators encountered so far in the journey. The corridor ahead is not only active, it is stable within the current cycle of movement. This stability allows for a shift in cognitive emphasis. Instead of constantly reconstructing the path from fragments, the hunters can now rely more on continuity assumptions. The landscape itself is behaving in a predictable enough manner that forward movement becomes less about interpretation at every step, and more about maintaining alignment with an established flow. However, even this stability carries a hidden tension. A system that is highly coherent is also more vulnerable to sudden disruption. A single break in the pattern caused by environmental shift, herd fragmentation, or external pressure can propagate quickly through the entire interpretive model. The hunters remain aware of this fragility even as they move within apparent coherence. Subtle indicators begin to suggest that the corridor ahead may soon open into another transitional zone. Vegetation density shifts slightly, and terrain spacing widens just enough to imply a forthcoming change in movement structure. These are early signals, not confirmations, but they are consistent with known migration behaviors where herds transition between constrained corridors and broader movement fields. The hunters adjust their attention accordingly, preparing for potential divergence while maintaining forward trajectory. The trail is no longer something they chase, it is something they accompany, staying close to its unfolding structure without attempting to control or accelerate it. What remains most striking is how deeply the landscape and movement have become intertwined. The trail is no longer separate from the environment, it is expressed through it, shaped by it, and continuously redefined by its conditions. And within that continuous redefinition, the hunters move forward, following not just signs on the ground, but the accumulated memory of countless journeys embedded within the land itself. The corridor finally loosens its grip on direction as the terrain opens into a wide, quiet expanse where movement no longer feels forced through narrow structure, but released into space. The land spreads outward in gentle gradients, and the sharp logic of convergence softens into a broader field where multiple paths could exist, yet one continues to carry the weight of repetition. The hunters do not stop. but their perception shifts again, as if the landscape is no longer demanding interpretation at every step, only recognition of a flow that has already been established. Here, the trail feels less like something discovered and more like something confirmed. The accumulated evidence of countless subtle signs, compressed vegetation, directional soil patterns, layered disturbances across time now resolves into a stable trajectory extending forward. Not perfect, not absolute, but consistent enough that doubt recedes into the background of awareness. This is not the end of uncertainty, but the point where uncertainty is no longer dominant. What lies ahead is still invisible in detail, but not in structure. The hunters understand that the herd is still within this system of movement, still responding to the same ecological pressures that shaped every step they have followed so far. Water, seasonal flow, terrain gradients, and predator presence continue to guide behavior in predictable rhythms. The land has not changed its language. Only its density of expression has thinned. As they move forward, there is a quiet recognition forming within the logic of tracking itself. What began as isolated observation of footprints in unstable ground has become a full system of environmental reading, one that integrates time, behavior, geography, and repetition into a unified understanding of movement. The hunters are not following a line anymore. They are moving within a structure that the land has been reinforcing long before their arrival. In the wider perspective, this is what makes the entire system so enduring. Tracking is not a technique that exists outside the environment, it is a way of participating in it. Every sign read is also a confirmation of deeper ecological rhythms. Every reconstructed path is also a reflection of how life organizes itself under pressure, scarcity, and seasonal change. Nothing in this system stands alone. There is also a deeper realization embedded in this continuity. The same intelligence that allows humans to reconstruct movement from fragments is the same intelligence that would later allow them to build maps, navigate oceans, and eventually abstract space into symbols. The roots of spatial reasoning, predictive modeling, and environmental interpretation are all already present here, embedded in the simple act of following traces across uncertain ground. Yet even as this broader understanding emerges, the hunters remain grounded in immediacy. The corridor ahead still matters more than its meaning. Survival is always local, always anchored in the next stretch of terrain, the next alignment of signs, the next confirmation that movement continues as expected. The larger structure is invisible unless it is broken. As long as it holds, it simply guides. A faint shift in wind passes through the open expanse, carrying with it subtle reminders of distance travelled and distance still remaining. The landscape does not offer resolution, it offers continuation. And in that continuation, the hunters remain aligned with something older than memory and more persistent than individual perception, the long, repeating logic of movement through land. The trail does not end here. It simply extends beyond what can currently be seen, dissolving into the same environmental systems that have shaped it from the beginning. The hunters follow not because they have reached certainty, but because the structure they have learned to read still holds. And as long as it holds, the path continues,